I have been to a great many briefings in my life, and I have learned that you can tell almost everything about a unit by the way it gathers before a hard night. The loud ones are usually the ones still trying to convince themselves. The quiet ones have already made their peace with the thing they are about to do. The outpost they sent us to that autumn was one of the quiet ones, and at the time I did not understand why, and so I read it wrong, the way you read a language you only think you know. We came up the valley road in the last gray of the afternoon, 4 of us in a borrowed truck, sent forward as observers and liaison to an Allied special unit we were not cleared to name in our own reports. I was a captain then, a Marine, 31 years old, with 2 tours behind me and the particular arrogance of a man who has seen enough to believe he has seen everything. My orders were simple and a little insulting. Watch, take notes, learn what we could, and stay out of the way. The Corps wanted to know how these people worked. We had heard things. We had heard they were the best in that whole theater, and like most men who have been told they are good at their job, I came up that road half-hopping to find out they were not. The outpost sat on a shoulder of high ground above a river, a cluster of low buildings and sandbag walls and a single crooked antenna mast that leaned like a tired man. Below it the valley opened out flat and pale, and across the water, 3 kilometers off and a little to the south, there was a walled compound the maps called by a number and the men there called the Salt Works, because long ago that was what it had been. It was a fortress now in everything but name. Thick mud brick walls, a central keep, outbuildings, a single gate, and inside it, we were told, a man who had taken 4 people who should not have been taken, and was using them the way such men use people, as a wall to hide behind. That was the job. Go in, bring the 4 out, and do something permanent about the man who had taken them. We were there to watch it done. The first person I saw when we climbed down from the truck was a woman bent over a folding table with a map weighted at its corners by stones, and I will be honest about what I thought, because the whole point of telling this is the honesty. I thought interpreter. I thought liaison. I thought she was the one they had sent to walk us through the paperwork, read us the rules, hand us our little laminated cards about what we were and were not allowed to see. She was not big. She wore the same dust-colored fatigues as the rest of them, sleeves down. A plate carrier hung over the back of her chair, and her hair was pulled back hard and going gray at the temple in a way that told you she was older than the lean young men moving crates behind her. She had a pencil behind her ear and another in her hand, and she was drawing something on the map, slow, the way a person draws who is thinking and not performing. She did not look up when we came in. That, too, I read wrong. I took it for the indifference of a clerk. I know now it was the concentration of a commander, and that there is a difference between a person who does not notice you and a person who has already noticed you, filed you, and decided you are not yet the most important thing in the room. Captain Reyes, I said, to no one in particular, the way you announce yourself when you expect to be received. Marine liaison were the observers. A young man with a radio looked over, said something quiet in their direction, and went back to his crate. The woman finished the line she was drawing. Then she set the pencil down, squared the map, and looked up at me, and her eyes were the kind of pale gray that does not give anything away, and she said in English with the faint burr of somewhere cold and far away, "You'll want the south wall of the keep then, for your notes. That's where it'll be decided." I did not know what she meant. I assumed she was repeating something she'd been told to say. "Sure," I said, the way you humor someone. "Is there an officer I should check in with, whoever's running the show tonight?" Behind me, one of my own men, a gunnery sergeant named Peterson, snorted very quietly. Peterson was a good Marine and a hard one, the kind who had earned the right to his certainties the slow way and guarded them like money. He had already taken the room's measure the way I had, and come to the same wrong conclusion, and the snort was for the 2 of us alone, a small private joke between men who think they understand a place. The woman heard it. I am sure now that she heard it. She did not so much as flick her eyes toward him. "You've checked in," she said to me mildly, and went back to her map. I took that for deflection, for a clerk not wanting the bother of finding the right person, and I let it go, because I was tired and the light was failing and I wanted coffee and a place to set my pack. A sergeant of theirs, a broad, calm man named Doyle, who I would come to respect more than almost any man I have known, showed us to a corner of the operations room and got us coffee in tin cups, and I sat down with my notebook and watched the unit prepare, and the whole time I watched the wrong things. I watched the young shooters check their kit. I watched the radios get tested. I watched a medic lay out his trauma gear with the unhurried precision of a man who has used it. I did not watch the woman at the map, because I had decided she did not matter, and there is no blindness so complete as the blindness of a man who has decided. The room filled as the dark came on. They were not loud. That was the first thing that began very slowly to bother me. I had been in rooms before a raid and they were full of a particular electricity, men talking too fast and laughing too hard, the noise you make to keep the fear company. This room had almost none of that. The men came in, drew their gear, found places to sit or lean and went still. They were waiting for something. Now and then one of them would glance toward the folding table where the woman stood, and then look away, and I took those glances for nothing. The way you take 100 things for nothing when you have already built the story of a place in your head. At full dark, Doyle came around and said, "Lo, brief in 5. You'll want to listen close, the captain runs it tight." "The captain," I said, and looked around the room for him. This captain, some hard-weathered man I had not yet been introduced to, and I felt the small embarrassment of an officer who has missed a name he should have caught. "Which one is he? I don't think I've met him." Doyle looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read, and there was something in it that I would only understand hours later, something almost like kindness, the kindness of a man who knows you are about to learn something and has decided to let you learn it cleanly. "You've met her," he said, and walked away to take his place along the wall. I sat with that. I did not believe it, not fully, not yet. A part of me decided Doyle was having a joke at the observer's expense, the way units do, sending the new man to find a left-handed wrench. I looked at Peterson and Peterson looked at me, and I saw the same disbelief in his face, harder than mine, the disbelief of a man whose whole understanding of how the world is arranged has just been told it is wrong and has not yet decided to allow it. Then the woman at the table set down her pencil for the last time, picked up a small worn pointer, and turned to face the room, and the room came to its feet. Not all at once, not like a parade. They rose the way men rise for something they respect, each in his own time, settling into stillness, and the easy noise of the room drained out of it entirely, and I found myself standing too, on instinct, before my mind had caught up with my body, because a room tells you what to do before you have decided whether to believe it. "All right," she said, just that, and every eye in the place went to her and stayed. I want to describe what she did in that brief because it was the first proof, though I did not yet have the sense to call it that. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She stood at the map with the pointer and she walked them through the night the way a surgeon walks through a procedure he has done 100 times and respects too much to rush. She started with the 4 hostages, not the walls, not the enemy, not the timeline, the 4 people. She named them by their situations, a father, 2 laborers, a boy of 14. And she said, in that flat, cold country voice, that the entire night was built around the simple problem of getting those 4 out of a building that a man had specifically arranged so that they could not be gotten out. Everything else, she said, the walls and the guns and the timing, was just the arithmetic of that one problem. Then she gave them the arithmetic. She had the compound drawn from memory, and she had it drawn correctly. I would see this with my own eyes before the night was over, every line of it true. She showed them the gate, which was the obvious way in and therefore the wrong way in. She showed them the river approach, the dead ground along the south where the wall's own height cast a shadow the defenders trusted too much. She showed them the keep and the south wall of the keep, and I remembered with a small cold feeling that this was the first thing she had said to me offhand, while I had stood there deciding she was a clerk. That's where it'll be decided. She had known it before I arrived. She had known it for days. She talked about the wall itself, the south face of it, and here she said something that I wrote down without understanding, and only understood later. She said the brick on that face had been laid in two different periods. You could see it in the courses, an older lower band and a newer patch above where the wall had been breached and rebuilt years before, and that the seam between the two was the weak line, not because it would fall down, but because the defenders had stopped thinking of it as a wall and started thinking of it as a repair, and men do not guard a repair the way they guard a wall. She was going to take them in through the place. No one was watching because no one believed it was a place at all. I had been on raids. I had planned a few. I had never in my life heard a wall read like that, like a sentence, like a thing with a history that could be turned against the people who lived behind it. I looked around the room while she spoke, at the young shooters, and I saw something on their faces I had not expected and did not have a name for yet. It was not the eager hunger I had seen in young men before a fight, the appetite for the thing that you find in soldiers who have not yet been hurt enough. It was attention, pure, total, undivided attention, the kind you give to a person whose every word you have learned the hard way is worth the keeping. These were not men being briefed. These were men being given the thread that would lead them out of the dark, and they took each turn of it from her the way you take a rope handed to you over a drop. I had walked into that room certain that I was the most experienced person in it, an officer of the finest fighting force in the world come to evaluate an ally, and I sat there now with the slow, cold understanding beginning that I might be the least, that there might be a kind of mastery in that room that my own service, for all its pride, did not often produce, and that I had nearly walked past it because it had a pencil behind its ear and did not raise its voice. She laid out the timing in a way I can only call merciless. Every element had its minute. Every minute had its reason. She built in pauses on purpose. There was a stretch near the middle of the plan where, she said, the assault would simply stop and go silent and still for 9 minutes, holding in the dark, and she explained why with a patience that did not sound like patience because it was so completely certain. The man in that compound, she said, had survived this long by reading the rhythm of raids, the build, the rush, the noise, the predictable crescendo. He had people who listened to the dark for that rhythm. So the plan would give him a rhythm and then it would stop, and the silence would last past the point where his listeners expected the next beat. And in that silence they would decide nothing was coming, and they would relax, and the next beat would land in the gap where their attention had fallen through. 9 minutes of doing nothing, built into the plan like a girder, because 9 minutes of nothing was a weapon if you had the nerve to spend it. I have thought about those 9 minutes many times since. It is one thing to be brave in motion. It is another entirely to be brave in stillness, to hold your whole force frozen in the dark inside arm's reach of the enemy and trust that the doing nothing is the doing. I did not believe, sitting in that room, that men could be made to hold that. I was wrong about that too. Near the end, she did the thing that finally cracked the shell of my certainty, though it would take the rest of the night to break it all the way. She asked for problems. Not in the rote way commanders ask, the way that means sit down and be quiet. She asked the way a person asks who actually wants to find the flaw before the flaw finds them, and a young shooter near the front raised the matter of the eastern outbuilding, a low shed that could hide a watcher with a clean line onto the dead ground she meant to cross. And instead of waving it off, she stopped and looked at the map for what felt like a long time, and then she changed the plan. Right there. She moved an element, retimed a piece of it, gave the shed its own small answer, and thanked the young man by name. She thanked him for finding the hole in her plan. I had served under men who would have had that shooter cleaning latrines for a week for the crime of implying their plan had a hole. And here is where my own disgrace lies. The small, ugly piece of the night that I have never told until now, because the whole reason to tell any of this is so that the next man who walks up a valley road full of himself might be a half-second slower to decide what he is looking at. When she opened the floor, before the young shooter spoke, I had a thought. I had spent 2 touring country and I fancied I knew its compounds, and I looked at her south wall approach across that strip of dead ground, and I thought I saw a problem she had missed. The ground looked, from her drawing, like it might be open to fire from the keep's upper windows. And being who I was, an observer who had decided the woman at the table was a clerk reading someone else's plan, I did not raise my hand and ask. I leaned over to Peterson and I said it to him, quiet, with a little smile, the smile of a man pointing out the flaw in the work of someone he has already decided is beneath him. I said, "She's got them crossing open ground under the keep windows. Somebody drew that map who's never been shot at." I said it quietly. I did not say it to her. That was the cowardice of it. I had a doubt and I spent it as a sneer instead of a question behind my hand to my own man, the way small men do. She heard me. I know now that she heard me because of what she did next, though at the time I thought it was coincidence. She did not look at me. She finished taking the young shooter's point about the shed, and then, almost as an afterthought, she put the pointer on exactly the strip of ground I had been sneering about, and she said to the room, not to me, "The dead ground along the south reads open on the map. It isn't. The keep's upper windows can't depress onto it. The wall's own parapet blocks the angle for the first 11 meters out from the base, and 11 meters is all we're in it. I've stood under that wall. The map lies. The wall doesn't. I have stood under that wall." The room moved on. Nobody looked at me. Peterson looked at me once and then looked very carefully at nothing, and I sat there with my notebook open and my face hot, and I understood in a first dim way that I had walked into that place knowing nothing and had spent the only currency I had, my doubt, on a joke instead of a question, and that she had answered the joke without ever acknowledging there had been one, which was a kind of mercy and a kind of judgment at the same time. That was the disrespect. I want to be plain that it was mine, not Peterson's snort, not the assumption any of us made. Those were the ordinary blindness any tired man might carry up a road. Mine was the deliberate one, the chosen one, the sneer behind the hand. And the proof that began that night was, in the end, the slow and total dismantling of it. The brief ended. She rolled the map, slid it into a tube, and the tube went onto her back beside her rifle, and that small thing struck me, that the plan and the gun went on the same body, that the woman who had drawn the night was going to walk into it at the front. She pulled the plate carrier off the back of her chair and put it on, and a young soldier helped her seat it, and somebody handed her a helmet, and the clerk I had invented in my head dissolved entirely and was replaced by something I did not yet have a name for, but was beginning, with a sinking and clarifying feeling, to understand I had badly misjudged. Doyle came past me on his way to the door. "South wall of the keep," he said, not unkindly. "She told you where to look the second you walked in. You ought to write that part down too." We went out into the dark, the observers a few steps back. And the column formed in the cold with that same unnerving quiet, and I watched her move down the line of her men in the starlight. A word here, a hand on a shoulder there, checking each one not like an officer inspecting but like a person counting something precious, and not one of them flinched from her or performed for her. And the easy contempt I had carried up the road felt, suddenly, very heavy and very cheap, and entirely mine to carry the rest of the way down into the valley. We crossed the river an hour before midnight, and the night began to teach me what I had refused to learn in the warm room. The water was low and black and colder than I expected, and we went over it in small groups, in the deep shadow of a stand of dead trees she had picked for exactly that shadow, and not a man splashed, and I understood that this too had been in the plan. The crossing point chosen for the trees, and the trees chosen for the dark, and the dark chosen for the eyes she knew were watching from the far wall. She was 3 men ahead of me in the column, and I watched the back of her, the map tube and the rifle, moving with an economy that wasted nothing, no wasted step, no wasted sound, and I began to count the small correctnesses of the night the way you count beads, because there was nothing else to do in the silence but count, and once I started I could not stop. I had crossed rivers on operations before, and I had always thought of the crossing as the dangerous dead time, the part you endured to get to the part that mattered. She did not treat it as dead time. She treated it as the first move of the assault, and watching her, I began to see that she did not really divide the night into a quiet part and a loud part the way the rest of us did. To her it was all one continuous problem, beginning the moment we left the wire, and the crossing was not a thing to survive on the way to the work. It was the work, the same as the breach would be, the same as the last room. There was a moment on that far bank that I have kept. We were low in the reeds, water still running off us, and one of the young shooters set his weight wrong and a stone shifted under his boot and made a small dull knock against another stone, the kind of sound that is nothing in daylight and everything at midnight a few hundred meters from a watched wall. The whole column went rigid. I felt the fear come up my own back. And she did not turn around, did not hiss, did not make the small furious gesture I had seen a dozen leaders make at a dozen such sounds. She simply stopped and held us stopped and let the sound die into the night and the night close over it, the same way she had held us against the false alarm later, the same way she would hold us in the courtyard, and she counted out the seconds it took for a listener on that wall to decide the knock had been a goat or a falling stone or nothing at all, and then she moved us on. She spent stillness the way other commanders spent rounds. She had a great deal of it, and she was not stingy with it, and she was never, ever in a hurry, and the longer I watched her the more I understood that the not hurrying was not calm laid over fear. It was a decision made so long ago and so completely that it had become the shape of her, the way water takes the shape of the stone it has run over for 1,000 years. The far bank had a cut in it where a seasonal stream came down, and she took us up the cut instead of over the open bank, and the cut hit us to the waist, and that was correct. The ground along the south of the compound was exactly the strip I had sneered at, and when we came onto it, low and slow, I looked up at the keep's dark windows above us, and I waited, with a tightness in my chest, for the angle that would expose us. And it never came, because the parapet hung over us just as she had said, 11 meters of dead air the windows could not reach, and we crossed it untouched, and I lay in the dirt at the base of the south wall with my heart going hard. Not from fear now, but from something closer to shame, because she had been right about a thing I had been certain she was wrong about, and she had been right because she had stood under that wall, and I had been wrong because I had stood over a map and decided I knew better than a woman I had never bothered to ask a question. The wall went up above us, pale in the starlight, and now I could see what she had described in the warm room, the two bands of brick, the older darker courses below and the patched lighter band above, and the seam between them running level along the face like a tied line on a rock. Her people were already at it, 2 of them, working without a wasted motion, and she crouched beside the seam with her hand flat against the brick, reading it with her fingers in the dark the way she had read it with her eyes on the map. And she found the place she wanted and marked it and stepped back, and the breachers went to work, quiet as they could be, and the whole assault held its breath around them. And here the plan did its first hard thing. They were nearly set, the charge nearly placed, when a sound came from the far side of the compound. A vehicle, an engine turning over, voices raised somewhere near the gate. A late arrival or a patrol or nothing. Every instinct in me, the instinct of a man trained to push when the window opens, screamed to go now, before whatever it was could matter. I saw the same instinct ripple through the young shooters around me, the small tightening of bodies wanting to move. She raised one hand flat and held it. She did not blow the charge. She did not rush. She held the whole assault frozen against the south wall while the engine ran and the voices carried and a light moved somewhere on the far side, and she read the sound. I watched her read it, her head tilted, her eyes on nothing. Her whole attention poured into her ears, and after a stretch of seconds that felt like an hour she made a small motion, fingers spreading, that meant wait, it's nothing, it's leaving. And it was. The engine pulled away. The voices faded toward the gate and out. The light went. And only then, when the false alarm had spent itself against her stillness, Did her hand drop and the charge go in and the work go on? I lay there in the dirt and I understood that I had just watched a person refuse the easiest, most natural action available to her, to go, to move, to spend the window and hold instead, because holding was correct and going was only fast. It is a rare thing to watch. Most of the courage you see in war is the courage to act. The courage to not act, to stand frozen with your whole force exposed and trust your own reading of the dark over the screaming of your instinct, is rarer. And I had been told the man in that compound survived by reading rhythm, and I was beginning to see that she was going to beat him by refusing to have one. The breach, when it came, was not the thunderclap I expected. It was a low, flat cough, muffled and shaped, more felt than heard, and the seam in the wall opened along exactly the line her finger had drawn, the old brick and the new parting where they had never truly been joined, and a hole stood there in the wall where a moment before there had been only a tied line, and her people went into it before the dust had finished falling. I went in with the second group, an observer who was no longer observing anything from a distance, and the inside of the saltworks closed around me, close walls and a smell of old stone and animals and cooking smoke, and the night narrowed down to corridors and doorways, and the small economical sounds of men moving through a building that did not want them. And it was in those corridors that I saw the thing I will carry to the end of my life, the thing that turned my shame into something else, into a kind of reverence I am not ashamed to name. The first rooms were empty, or held only the ordinary contents of a place where people lived under a hard man, sleeping mats, a cold hearth, the smell of fear that is soaked into stone. We took them one at a time, and I learned the grammar of how she ran it, the small flat hand signs, the way the pairs flowed and covered, the way she let her young men be fast where fast was safe and made them slow exactly where slow would keep them alive. I had thought in the warm room that I knew what a cleared building looked like. I had cleared buildings, but I had cleared them the way most of us do, as a series of separate fights, room by room, each one its own small war. She cleared this one as a single thing, the way she did everything, holding the whole shape of it in her head, so that taking the third room was already setting up the taking of the fifth, and a man covering a stairwell on the ground floor was, without quite knowing it, protecting a pair 2 floors up. I cannot fully explain the difference. I can only say that I had been in the trade for years and I felt, moving through that building behind her, like an apprentice who has just watched a master, and understood for the first time that there was a level above the one he had topped out on. There was a bad moment in a narrow back hallway. A door we had marked as clear was not clear. A man had been behind it, flat against the wall in the dark, and he came out into the hall behind the lead pair after they had passed, which is the oldest and ugliest way for a clearance to go wrong, the threat appearing where you have already decided there is none. He had his rifle up and a clean line on the backs of 2 of her young men, and it was the kind of thing that happens in the space of a single heartbeat and is over before the mind has caught up, and it should have cost us 2 men in that hallway. It did not, because she had not, in fact, decided that door was clear. She trusted nothing she had not seen with her own eyes, and even moving forward she had left a sliver of her attention on the rooms behind her, the slices already passed, because she knew that the slice you stop watching is the slice that kills you. She was already turning when the man came out. She did not fire wildly into a hallway with her own men in it. She stepped, that sideways economical step I had watched her use on the boy's captor, taking herself off the crowded line and onto a clean one, and she put a single round into the man before his finger closed, and he folded into the doorway he had hidden behind, and the 2 young shooters spun around to a threat that was already down, and one of them looked at her with an expression I will not forget. The look of a man who has just understood, viscerally in his own body, that he is alive because of something his commander did that he himself did not even see happen. She did not acknowledge it. She put the hallway back together with 2 hand signs and we moved on, and I added it to the count, the long, quiet count of the night's correctnesses, which by now I had stopped keeping out of skepticism and started keeping out of something closer to awe. We came around a corner into a low room, and there was a man there, one of theirs, armed, and between him and us, on the floor against the far wall, was the boy, the 14-year-old, one of the four. The man had heard the breach and the movement, and he had pulled the boy in front of him, a hand twisted in the boy's collar, the muzzle of his rifle swinging up, and for one frozen instant the geometry of it was exactly the nightmare every raider dreads. The hostage and the captor in one line, the shot that saves and the shot that kills occupying the same square foot of air. The young shooter beside me had his rifle up. I saw his finger. I saw the shot there, available fast, the shot that any manual would call justified, the shot that would almost certainly drop the man and very possibly the boy, the shot that says I did everything I could. She was already moving past him. She put her hand flat on the young shooter's barrel and pressed it down gently, and she stepped not fast. That is the part I cannot make people understand. She did not rush. She stepped sideways and low into the room, off the line, changing the angle, taking the boy out of the geometry by moving her own body to where the shot no longer had to pass through him. It cannot have taken more than a few seconds. It felt like the slowest thing I have ever watched. The man tracked her, the muzzle swinging, and she let him track her, because every degree he swung toward her was a degree he swung off the boy. And when the angle was finally clean, when the line from her rifle to the man no longer touched the child at all, she took the shot, one shot, and the man went down and the boy did not. And she was already across the room with her hand out for the child before the sound had finished bouncing off the stone. She had refused the fast shot. She had spent her own exposure, had walked herself into the open, into the man's aim, deliberately, for 90 seconds of slow sideways motion that no manual would have asked of her, in order to buy an angle that did not cost the boy. The young shooter's shot would have been called clean by any board in the world. Hers was the one that brought the boy home. There is a difference between the two, and most men live their whole lives without having to know it. And I learned it in a low stone room in the middle of a night, watching a woman I had sneered at fold a frightened child against her plate carrier, and say something to him in his own tongue, low, that I did not understand and did not need to. We pushed deeper into the compound, and the night settled into the rhythm of the thing she had built, and I want to describe that rhythm because it was the heart of the proof, and the proof was not one moment but 100 small ones laid end to end. She cleared the building by listening. That is the only way I know to say it. The young men moved in their pairs, fast and disciplined, but it was her ears that ran the assault. At each junction she would stop, just for a breath, and tilt her head, and the whole element would freeze around her, and she would parse the dark, the scrape of a foot 2 rooms over, the click of a safety somewhere above, the particular quality of a silence that meant a room was empty against the slightly different silence that meant a room was holding its breath. She covered every slice of every doorway, high and low, and she made the young men cover them too, and twice I watched her put a hand on a shooter and stop him from sweeping past a stairwell or a vent or a high shuttered window that he, in the speed of the thing, had not weighted heavily enough. She weighted everything. She had a place in her attention for the ceiling and the floor and the dark behind the door, and nothing got past her because she had decided, somewhere in a long career I knew nothing about, that the thing that kills you is the slice you did not cover, and she had made not covering a slice into something close to impossible. And she rationed. This is the part the films never show and the part that wins the night. They had carried in only what they could carry, charges and rounds and the medic's blood and a finite amount of the small precious things a raid runs on, and she spent all of it like a woman counting coins onto a table. She would not let a breacher blow a door that could be opened. She would not let a shooter spend a burst where a single round would do. When the medic worked on one of the laborers they found in a back room, a man who had been beaten and could not walk, she allotted the time and the hands for it out of the night's whole budget the way you allot water on a long march, enough and not a second more, because every second and every hand spent here was a second, and a hand not available 3 rooms on. I watched that one closely, because it was the hardest kind of decision to watch and the easiest kind to get wrong, and it told me as much about her as the breach or the gap or the refused shot. The laborer was in a bad way, half-conscious, his legs gone under him from days of what had been done to him, and the natural human thing, the decent thing, the thing every instinct in a good man screams to do, is to stop everything and fix the suffering in front of you. She did not stop everything. She gave the medic exactly 2 men and a hard number of minutes, and she said the number out loud flat, and then she kept the assault moving around the small island of care she had carved out, because she was holding the whole night in her head, and she knew that to pour the night's resources into the man in front of her was to spend them on one life and risk the other 6. It looked cold from the outside. It was the opposite of cold. It was the most disciplined kind of mercy there is, the kind that loves all of them at once and will not sacrifice the many to the feeling of the moment. And I saw the medic understand it, and accept it, and work inside the box of time she had drawn for him with a focus that the box itself made possible. They got the laborer up. They got him moving, slung between 2 men, inside the minutes she had allowed, and not a soul was lost 3 rooms on for the time she had refused to overspend here. I have made decisions like that since, in my own command, and I have never made one without thinking of her flat voice nomming the number in that back room, and I have never once found it easy, and I have come to believe that the not finding it easy is the whole point, that she felt every ounce of what those decisions cost and made them correctly anyway, which is the only definition of that kind of leadership I have ever been able to trust. I had been raised to think of a raid as an explosion of force. She ran hers as an economy, and the economy was the genius of it. Because she had built the whole thing to outlast a man who was counting on the raiders to run out of time, of nerve, of rounds, of the will to keep being careful when carelessness would be faster. She was never going to run out, because she had counted everything before she crossed the river. The men leaned on her. I saw it happen in real time, the young hard shooters who feared nothing turning toward her at every hinge of the night, not out of weakness, but out of a trust so complete it had stopped being a decision and become a reflex. When a thing went wrong, and things went wrong, a door that was barred from the inside, a corridor that turned out shorter than the map, a wounded laborer who could not be moved as planned, they did not panic and they did not improvise wildly. They turned to her, and she gave them the next correct thing in that same flat, unhurried voice, and they did it, and the wrong thing became a problem with a solution instead of a crisis. I have served under a great many leaders. I have been a leader of men myself. I had never until that night seen a force move with that particular quality, where the commander's calm was not something she projected onto frightened men, but something the men had absorbed so deeply that they carried it themselves, so that the calm was distributed through the whole element like load through a good bridge, and no single point ever had to bear more than it could. Then came the gap, the 9 minutes. We had pushed to the inner courtyard, the last open ground before the keep, and the 4 hostages were not yet all accounted for, 3 of them gathered now and moving with the medic and a covering pair toward the breach. But the 4th, the father, was somewhere in the keep itself, and the man who had taken them all was in there too, and between us and the keep door was 30 meters of open courtyard that his people could rake from the upper windows the moment they understood we had come this far. This was the place she had told us about in the warm room. This was where she spent the 9 minutes. She brought the whole assault to a stop in the deep shadow along the courtyard's edge, and she made it go silent, and she made it go still, and she made it stay that way. No movement, no radio above a breath, nothing. And the strangeness of it, the wrongness of it against every instinct in my body, came down on me like a weight. We were inside the enemy's home. We had blown his wall and shot his men and taken his hostages off the floor one by one. Every fiber of me wanted to finish it, to rush the keep, to spend the momentum we had bought so dearly. And she made us hold. She made 40 hard men hold their breath in the dark within a stone's throw of a cornered enemy and do absolutely nothing, on her word, because she had decided in advance that nothing was the move. I lay against the cold wall and I watched the seconds bleed, and I felt the silence change shape around us. At first it was our silence, taut and ready. Then slowly, as the minutes piled up past the point where the next beat of a normal raid should have fallen, I felt it become his silence. I felt, across that courtyard, the enemy's listeners reaching the end of their expectation. The rhythm she had fed them, the build and the breach and the push, had stopped and gone on stopping, and somewhere in the keep, a man who had survived a dozen raids by reading their music was hearing no music at all, and was beginning, against his own discipline, to believe that the thing had passed, that we had taken what we came for and gone, that the storm had broken somewhere else. I have to tell you what those minutes did to me, because the doing of nothing was harder on me than any of the doing had been. When you are moving, when you are clearing a room or crossing a wall, the body has a job and the fear goes into the job. But there is no job in stillness. There is only the waiting, and the cold coming up out of the stone into your chest, and the awful arithmetic your own mind starts running, that every second we held was a second the father in the keep might be killed, a second the enemy might use to ready a counterstroke, a second the whole fragile night might come apart. Everything I had ever been taught screamed that you do not give a cornered enemy time, that time is his only ally, that you must finish what you start before the situation can turn. And she gave him time. She gave him 9 whole minutes of it deliberately, and I lay there in an agony of disagreement, certain in my gut that she was wrong, that the boldness she had shown all night had finally tipped over into a hesitation that would cost us everything. I was wrong, of course. I had been wrong about her at every single juncture of that night, and I was wrong again here in the same way for the same reason, because I was reading the surface of the thing and she was reading the depth of it. The time she was giving him was not a gift. It was a trap baited with his own expectations. She knew something about him that I did not, that none of us did, which was the exact shape of the rhythm he listened for. And she was feeding him the silence the way you feed a fish line, letting it run, letting him believe he had won the small private bet every defender makes in the dark. That the raiders had not had the nerve, that they had taken the easy 3 and left the hard one, that the night was over. The longer the silence ran, the more completely he had to believe it, because no force on earth, his experience told him, holds still inside a breached compound for 9 minutes with the work unfinished. No sane force does. He did not know he was up against someone who had decided, long before she crossed the river, to be exactly that, insane, and to make a virtue and a weapon out of the one thing he could not imagine. I could not see him. I did not need to. I could feel the attention come off the courtyard the way you feel a held stare finally drop. The upper windows, which had been a held breath of danger, became just windows. The man's listeners had decided nothing was coming, because for 9 real minutes nothing had. Her hand moved, and we crossed the 30 meters of courtyard in the gap where his attention had fallen through, fast and silent and unopposed, and we were at the keep door before a single shot came down from those windows, because the men at those windows had stopped believing there was anything left to shoot at. I crossed those 30 meters in her track, close enough to see how she ran even now, with the gap spent and the dash on, and she did not run the way men run toward danger, all forward lean and spent breath. She moved like someone crossing a frozen river who knows exactly where the ice is thin, fast but reading, her eyes going up to the windows and down to the ground and back, spending the gap she had bought but not trusting it past its worth, ready in the same stride to fight if the gap closed early. It did not close. She had spent the silence correctly and bought the crossing hole, and we made the keep door clean, and I understood that even the dash, the part that looked like simple speed, was just more of the same arithmetic run very fast. I have turned those 9 minutes over in my mind for years. I have tried to imagine having the nerve to spend them, and I am not sure, even now, even knowing how they ended, that I would have had it. To do nothing, on purpose, with everything on the line, and trust that the doing nothing is the deadliest thing you can do, That is a kind of command I did not know existed until I lay in that courtyard and watched a woman I had dismissed wield silence like a blade. The keep door gave to the breachers and we went up the stair, and this was the last hard room of the night, and it was the worst, and it was where the cost came due. The man was there, in a low room at the top, with the father in front of him and a pistol against the older man's head, and three of his own around him, and this time there was no clean angle to be bought with patience, because he had put his back to the corner and the hostage filled the only line. He was talking fast, the talk of a man who has decided he is going to die and means to take the room with him, and her people flowed up the stair behind her and spread along the walls, and the standoff locked into place, the muzzles and the math, and I thought, here is where the careful night breaks, here is where there is no good answer. She did not raise her voice. She stood in the doorway with her rifle down, not up down, and she spoke to him in his own language, low and level, the same voice she had used for everything, the voice that did not change for the easy parts or the hard parts, and I did not understand the words, but I understood the shape of what she was doing, because I had been watching her do versions of it all night. She was giving him a thing to do other than die. She was building him a door, the way she had built doors out of brick seams and silence and angles all night long. She was finding the one path out of the room that did not end with the father dead, and she was laying it in front of him, calm, patient, unhurried, with the pistol against the old man's skull, and her own people screaming at her in the silence of their held fire to just end it. It did not work cleanly. I will not pretend it did, because the whole reason to tell this truly is that it did not. The man broke for the worst of it, the pistol coming around, and in the half-second of it her shooters fired and so did his, and the room came apart in noise and muzzle light. And when it cleared, the man and his three were down, and the father was alive on the floor with her hand pinning a wound in his shoulder, alive, breathing, taken. And one of her own young shooters, the one who had raised the matter of the eastern shed in the warm room, the one she had thanked by name, was down too. And the medic was already on him, and he did not get up. She did not break. I watched her face in the muzzle smoke and the gray almost light leaking now through a high slit window, and she did not break. She got the father stabilized and handed him to hands that could carry him, and she went to the young shooter, and she knelt by him for the few seconds the night could spare, and she put her hand flat on his chest the way she had put it flat on the brick, reading something, and then she closed his eyes with 2 fingers, and she said his name once, quietly, the same name she had thanked in the warm room. And then she stood up, and she gave the order to move, because the night was not over, and the living had to be carried out past the place where the dead now were. That was the only moment in the whole night I saw the cost reach her, not as rage, not as tears, as a stillness that lasted exactly 1 second longer than her other stillnesses, a held breath she did not let anyone see her take, and then she put it down the way she had taught her men to put fear down, off to the side, where it could be picked up later, when picking it up would not kill anyone, and she carried us all out of that compound on the strength of having already decided, hours before, exactly how we were going to leave. Because the leaving was in the plan too. Of course it was. The extraction was not a scramble for the wall, it was a reverse of everything she had built, run backward with the same economy, the hostages in the center and the wounded distributed, and the covering elements peeling in the order she had assigned in the warm room while I sat there deciding she was a clerk. We came back down through the keep and across the courtyard, and now the compound was waking in earnest, the man's whiter people understanding at last what had been done to them in their own walls, and fire began to come. And this was the part where a raid most often dies, the long, ugly walk out under a roused enemy with your hands full of wounded and your momentum spent. It did not die. She held the column together by the same means she had held it all night, the flat voice on the radio giving each element its next correct thing, the ammunition she had rationed all night still in the magazines now when it was needed most, the covering position she had assigned hours ago falling into place, because the men had walked the plan in their heads so many times in the warm room that their bodies knew it in the dark. This was the part I had braced for as the part that kills raids, and I learned in it the last lesson of the night, which was that her economy had been building toward exactly this moment all along. The other forces I had served with would have come to this walkout already spent, ammunition burned in the easy early rooms, men's nerves spent on the fast wrong things, the plan improvised away to nothing in the friction of contact, so that the hardest part of the night was attempted with the least left to do it. She had done the reverse. She had hoarded everything for the leaving, the rounds and the men's composure and the integrity of the plan, so that the column that walked out under a fully roused enemy was, if anything, steadier than the one that had crossed the river, because it had been spending itself carefully for hours and had been built to have its strength left at the end instead of the beginning. The fire came down on us, and the men answered it in measured, controlled bursts. No panic, no spray, each shooter holding to the discipline she had distributed through them like load through a good bridge. And the column moved as one careful organism back toward the breach in the south wall, never bunching, never stalling, the wounded in the center and the covering elements peeling in turn. And I realized I was watching the plan she had drawn in the warm room run backward to its last line, and that it held. That all of it held, because she had never once that whole night spent a thing she would need later. The breach in the south wall was where she had left it, and the dead ground under the parapet was still dead, still untouchable by the upper windows just as she had promised, and we went out the way we came in, low and fast through the 11 meters the wall could not reach, carrying our wounded and our 3 living hostages and the body of the young man who had found the flaw in her plan and been thanked for it. We crossed the river as the sky behind the eastern ridge went from black to the deep iron gray that comes before any color, and we came up the cut in the bank and onto the friendly shoulder of high ground, and the outpost was there above us with its crooked antenna, and only when the last man and the last hostage and the last of the wounded were inside the wire did she stop and stand and let the night be over. The dawn came up gray and then pale gold over the valley, and it found us spent on the ground inside the wire, the assault element scattered in exhausted heaps the way men are after a long night that has cost them, and the 3 hostages wrapped in blankets and shaking and alive, and the medic still working, and the body of the young shooter laid out under a poncho with a care that told you everything about the unit that had carried him home. And I sat against a sandbag wall with my notebook unopened in my lap, because I had not written a single word since the warm room, because there had not been a moment all night when I was an observer of anything, and I looked at the woman I had decided was a clerk, and I finally let myself understand what I had spent the night watching. It was Doyle who told me the rest, in the gray light, in the flat voice of a man too tired to make a thing more than it was. He told me her call sign, which was the only name any of them used for her in the field, a hard, plain word from her cold, far country. He told me, because I had earned the telling by then, if only by surviving the night beside her, a little of what was in the record that men like me were not cleared to read, that she had been doing this kind of work, the quiet, ugly, necessary work of taking people back from men who should not have taken them, for longer than some of the young shooters in that compound had been alive. That there were nights like this one stacked up behind her, years of them, in places that did not get names in any newspaper, and that the people she had carried home out of those places numbered in the dozens, and that she had never once in any of it been the loud one, or the famous one, or the one the cameras found, because the whole architecture of who she was had been built around the 4 people on the floor and never around herself. She was not the liaison. She had never been the liaison. She was the one who drew the night and walked into it at the front and carried it out on her back, and she had been standing at that folding table with a pencil behind her ear, because she was the captain Doyle had told me I had already met, and I had looked at her and seen paperwork. The shame of that should have been the end of what I felt. It was not. The shame burned off in the gray light and left something cleaner underneath it, something I had not expected, which was gratitude, Not the small gratitude of a man glad to be alive, though I was that, but the larger and stranger gratitude of a man who has been shown, once in his life, the real thing, the thing all the loud men spend their careers imitating, and has been allowed to know the difference forever after. She came across the compound in that gold light to check on the hostages, the way she had checked on her men in the starlight, counting something precious, and she crouched by the boy, the 14-year-old, the one she had taken out of the geometry with her own body, and she said something to him and he almost smiled. And then she straightened and turned to go to the wounded, and her path took her past where Gunnery Sergeant Peterson and I sat against the wall. And Peterson stood up. I want to be careful here, because this is the moment the whole night had been walking toward, and I do not want to dress it up. Peterson was the hardest man I had brought up that road, the one whose snort had started the whole thing, the one whose certainties were oldest and best defended. He had spent 20 years earning the right to decide who was and was not the real article, and he had decided about her in the first 3 seconds and been wrong. And now, in the gray-gold dawn, sore and filthy and emptied out, he got to his feet as she came past, and he came to attention, not the loose courtesy you give a rank, but the full thing, the thing a Marine does with his whole body for something he has decided is true, and he raised his hand and he saluted her. Stopped. She looked at him, that pale gray gaze, and for a moment I think she was deciding whether to allow it, the way she had decided about the salute in the warm room when the men rose, the way she decided about everything. And then she returned it once clean, and she said to him in that flat, cold country voice, the only thing she ever said to either of us directly about what had passed, "Your man crossed the river quiet. That's worth something out here." Meaning Peterson had done his small part right. Meaning she had seen even that. And she went on to the wounded, and Peterson lowered his hand and stood there a moment longer than he needed to, and did not look at me, and I understood that he had just done the bravest thing I would see a Marine do that whole tour, which was to stand up in front of his own captain and salute the proof that he had been wrong. I got up too then. Of course I did. I came to attention against that sandbag wall in the dawn with the valley going gold below us, and I raised my hand to the back of a woman who was already kneeling by a wounded man and not watching, who would never know whether the observer she had answered with a fact instead of a rebuke had saluted her or not, and I held it there until my arm ached, because the salute was not for her to see. It was for me to mean. It was the only way I had to set down, out loud and with my whole body, the sneer I had spent behind my hand in the warm room, and to put in its place the thing the night had taught me. The other Marines stood, one by one, the way her own men had risen in the briefing room, not on an order, not all at once. Each in his own time, as the understanding reached him, until the 4 of us were on our feet in the gold light with our hands raised to a woman who had her back to us, kneeling in the dirt over a man she was trying to keep alive, and who had never once that whole night asked any of us to think well of her, and had earned it anyway completely, by the only currency that has ever counted out there, which is what you do in the dark when you think no one is keeping the kind of score that matters. They put her call sign in the record that morning, and the record went where such records go, into a drawer in a building far away that almost no one will ever open. I sat with Doyle a while longer in that gold light, the 2 of us watching the medic finish his work, and I asked him the question that had been building in me since the warm room, the question of how a person becomes what she was. He thought about it for a long time, longer than I expected, and then he said something I have repeated to myself more times than I can count. He said she had told him once, years before, on another bad morning after another long night, that the secret was not courage and was not skill, though she had both in a measure he had never seen matched. The secret, she had said, was that she had decided a long time ago to be more afraid of doing the wrong thing than of doing the hard thing, and that almost everyone in the trade had it backwards. They were so afraid of the hard thing, the slow thing, the still thing, the thing that exposed them, that they reached for the fast wrong thing to make the fear stop, and the fast wrong thing got people killed. She had simply trained herself over 20 years to fear the right thing. That was all. That was the whole of it. To be more afraid of the boy dying than of her own 90 seconds in the open. To be more afraid of a botched night than of a long one. To be more afraid of getting it wrong than of looking slow. Once you feared the right things, Doyle said she had told him, the rest was just arithmetic, and she was very good at arithmetic. I have turned that over for years, and I think it is the truest thing anyone has ever told me about my own profession, and I think it is why she was what she was and most of us are not. We fear the wrong things. We fear looking hesitant more than we fear being wrong. She had burned that out of herself somewhere. In some long war I will never know the half of, and what was left was a person who could hold 40 men still in the dark for 9 minutes, because she was simply not afraid of the things that would have made another commander move. 3 people went home who would not have. A boy of 14 grew up somewhere who would not have. And a young shooter who found the flaw in her plan and was thanked for it by name came home under a poncho, carried by men who would have carried him 100 miles, and his name went into a different and harder record, the one she closed with 2 fingers in the muzzle smoke, and did not let any of us see her grieve until the living were safe. I went back down the valley road a few days later with my notebook nearly empty and my understanding of my profession remade. And in the years since I have told the technical parts of that night many times, in classrooms and after actions, the brick seam and the 9 minutes and the refused shot, because they are worth teaching, and I would be a poor steward of what I was shown if I kept them to myself. But the part I have never told until now is the part about the sneer, the part where the man telling you all this came up a road so full of himself that he looked at the best soldier he would ever see, and decided she was there to read him the paperwork. I tell it now because somewhere there is another young captain on another road, certain the way I was certain, and if these words reach him, I would have him be a half-second slower than I was to decide what he is looking at, and a half-second faster to turn a doubt into a question instead of a joke. She would not remember me. I am sure of that. I was one observer among the hundreds of small things she counted and filed and set in their proper place on a single night in a long war full of such nights. But I remember her, every line of her, the pencil behind the ear and the map tube on her back, beside the rifle and the flat cold voice that never rose and never broke, and the way a room of hard men came to their feet when she set down a pencil and picked up a pointer, and the way, at dawn, my own hardest sergeant stood up and saluted the proof that he had been wrong. That is the truest thing I know about what the word elite is supposed to mean. It is not the loudest unit or the most decorated man. It is the quiet woman at the folding table whom 4 strangers and 1 boy of 14 are alive because of this morning, who drew the whole night out of a wall's history and a stretch of silence, and the mercy to spend her own life buying an angle that would not cost a child, and who carried us all home and then knelt in the dirt to grieve her dead where she thought we could not see. I saw. I have made it my business every day since to make sure that what I saw does not go unsaid.